Okay, so I just wanted to offer a few thoughts on the debate yesterday that I think Sneeko hosted, reposted on Orthodox Muslims channel, where Cliff and Stuart connectedly debated Korra, the Taimian, and also Orthodox Muslim. And they were just debating a general debate on Christianity versus Islam. No specific thesis or anything like that. And it was about 2 hour discussion. And I was quite shocked by the performance of Cliff and Stuart. Not that I'm, a huge follower of theirs and have really followed their material or think very highly of their debating skills. But it was so bad that I was left really stunned. One thing that stood out to me is that they said something along the lines of Jesus is part of God. I actually played a video clip of that last night in a short. Jesus is part of God, because they were asked the question, how many gods were crucified on the cross? And Cliff just jumps in there and says, part of God was crucified. Jesus is a third of God. And I'm just thinking, okay, so you've never heard of the heresy of partialism. You don't know what that is. You don't know the basics of Nicene Trinitarianism, and you've been doing debates for how long? Well, look, the reality is these guys just dunk on college students on college campuses. That's not much of a victory. They're not debating highly educated and informed people. So they often come across as very well educated when, in fact, they don't even know the basics of Trinitarianism. So partialism, wow, okay, we're really going with that one. And what's funny is a lot of people critique the Quran because, and I think it's Surah 5, it talks about Christians say that Allah is three of a third, something like that, right? Or third of three. And a lot of people are just saying, well, hey, wait, that's not the Trinity. The Quran gets this wrong. It doesn't even understand what the Trinity is. And here comes Cliff and Stuart connectedly saying exactly what the Quran says. That Jesus is a third. So it's like, well, I guess that's probably what the Quran is referring to, right? It's these partialists. Cliff, man, you got to step it up. So I think it was Cliff as well, said this, and really, it was clear that Korra and Orthodox Muslim were visibly taken back by this statement. He said something along the lines of, the Father is the only true God. Well, rather, Orthodox Muslim, I think, asked him, what do you do with John 17, where Jesus says to the Father, you're the only true God? What do you make of that? If Jesus is fully consubstantial with the Father, in what sense can you ever say the Father is the only true God? And of course, there's, 1,000 attempts that Trinitarian scholars have tried to offer to explain it. But what Cliff tried to go to was that, the Father is the only true God, but the Son and Spirit are the Father. What? Okay, that's called modalism. What are you talking about? So you could see Korra kind of puts her hands up at that point, and Orthodox Muslim was also visibly shocked, because you don't expect people who have been debating for decades to make such simple mistakes, right? And of course, Cliff was embarrassed and offended, like, why are you guys mocking me? Well, I don't think that was any mockery. I am, in general, against mockery when it comes to debates. I think that we should try to have good character and avoid those things unless absolutely necessary. But I didn't take that as mockery. I just took it as they legit were very shocked that they would say something so stupid. And I was as well. And so I don't think that's mockery. I just think you really need to step it up, because what are you doing here? This is wild. And okay, hey, look, if you don't really know about this stuff, that's cool, but just don't make debating your thing, right? And don't go and debate Muslims if this is not your area. That's fine. Just say, hey, look, I don't really know a lot about this. All right, fair enough. But when you put yourself in that situation, you're expected to know more than this. Also, the inconsistency in moral standards. I hear this all the time in apologetics, and it's exhausting. And it's usually from people who are ignorant of the Old Testament. But in this particular case, Cliff and Stuart are not ignorant of the Old Testament. They'll say, well, look at this in Muhammad's life, or look at this in the Quran, and look how bad these moral standards are. And every single time, whatever they're critiquing in Muhammad or the Quran or Islamic history, you could just apply that right back to biblical history, to the Old Testament, sometimes to the New Testament. You could just critique God in the Bible in the exact same way. So it undermines Christianity, and also by extension Judaism, whenever these inconsistent moral arguments are applied. I don't find them helpful, because I think maybe an atheist could say these things, right? An atheist could critique Islam on the basis of those things, although there might be difficulties with the atheists elsewhere. But an atheist, I'm saying, would be at least a little bit more consistent, because they're not going to affirm the Old Testament or even the New Testament. So there's that point as well. And I think that really needs to be considered. And also, on that point of moral consistency, often the response and the one that they used was, well, God is kind of incrementally adjusting things because of how bad things were. I don't think it's a good argument to say, well, look how bad the nations around the Israelites were, therefore it's not as bad here. I don't think that's a good argument, because of course the response is going to be, but wait, God is supposed to be better than the nations around them, and due to the hardness of their hearts. Okay, well, look, they had a hard heart when it comes to idolatry, but God forbid them to engage in idolatry. He didn't make concessions there, did he? Well, I don't know. Actually, there are some concessions in the Old Testament on idolatry, right? One of the prophets allows, according to the Old Testament, an individual to bow to a statue of Baal. I think in the temple of Rimmon, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, you get what I'm saying. On the whole, he's not making huge concessions to idolatry. So, okay, if he's willing to go that far on that, why can't he go that far on slavery, the treatment of women, stuff like that? So I don't think it's a very good argument. I think that often people just aren't aware of how some of these things are in the Old Testament. It appears that maybe Cliff and Stuart also weren't fully aware of the extent of, for example, the treatment of women. But again, this idea of, well, God's working with them to incrementally change things. Well, God is still authorizing and in many cases commanding these things in the Old Testament, and God doesn't command evil. So you still have the same problem. You can't say, well, God fixed it later. It's been fixed later in the New Testament. You still have the same problem. So stop it with this. You might want to drop that talking point. I'm just saying. And so I find it to be undermining and damaging to Christianity when I see apologists in debates do these things. Also, I was pretty surprised that Cliff said, that God doesn't will everything. He portrayed Islam as teaching determinism. I've seen a lot of Muslims who would contest that and seem to hold to a view of perhaps compatibilism or something that would be very similar to what I've seen many in the Catholic tradition, for example, hold to. But be that as it may, he says God doesn't will all things. And so, when somebody's raped or somebody's killed, God doesn't will that. Well, I understand what you mean insofar as God isn't actively willing it, insofar as God doesn't want evil. I understand what he's trying to say there, but when you say just absolutely blank, point blank, unqualified, God doesn't will these things, so you're saying God isn't sovereign. So you're saying that God hasn't predestined and decreed all things? Well, the Bible teaches that God has predestined and decreed all things explicitly. That's not even implied. It's not some kind of inference or anything. It's something that's explicit there. For example, in Ephesians. So you have to grapple with that, right? And it appears he's not very well aware of that. Of course, there's a distinction between God's active will and his permissive will. So yes, it's willed by God insofar as it's his permissive will. Those are usually the common responses. It seems that Cliff wasn't even aware of that concept. So what are you doing here? This has been around since what? John of Damascus, who's been talking about the distinction in God's will, and so that was pretty wild. Another thing, they were talking about the 5,800 Greek manuscripts. It's a talking point made famous by especially Dan Wallace and Wes Huff more recently. And look, I've spoken about this in my lectures, and I've pointed out this is just a really bad talking point that needs to go. Trying to say, well, look, we have 5,800 Greek manuscripts testifying to the transmission of the New Testament. By the way, they never talk about the transmission of the Old Testament. Notice that, right? But, okay, let's just talk about the New Testament. 5,800 Greek manuscripts. Well, look, I think Orthodox Muslim pointed out the vast majority of them, over 90% of those, are from the 9th century and later. So that doesn't really tell us a whole lot about the text in the 1st century or 2nd century, right? We might have a fragment, P52, from arguably from the 2nd century, but it's the size of a credit card. It's tiny. It doesn't tell us a lot about the transmission of the entire Gospel of John, let alone the rest of the Gospels, let alone the rest of the New Testament. You have to wait until the 4th century to get complete copies of many of the books of the New Testament, whereas you have fragmentary manuscripts prior to that at best. And so this is a really bad talking point because it doesn't get you where you want to go. It doesn't tell you about the transmission of the text in the 1st century, what the text looked like in the 1st century. It just simply doesn't. And look, this is something that Muslims are aware of. You know, there's Dr. Sami Ameri, who wrote this book called Hunting for the Word of God. And what he attempts to do in the book is he attempts to critique the transmission of the Old and New Testament and juxtapose it with the transmission of the Quran. And he does that in that book. So they're well aware of these issues surrounding the transmission of the text of the New Testament, a lot of the difficulties there, and they respond to a lot of the common objections about the ahruf and kirat and stuff like that I think most people in the conversation aren't very well aware of. They'll try to bring this up, but then they don't know a whole lot about it. Muslims are already aware of this stuff on both sides, the transmission of both texts. And so they're already engaging these points. Unless you're incredibly aware of this stuff, you might not want to bring it up because you're going to have your lunch eaten. And that's exactly what happened here with Cliff. It was the most embarrassing thing to witness. Let me also say, it seems like there was a great deal of a lack of awareness on debates surrounding authorship and whether or not the authors of the Gospels are eyewitnesses. Guys like Cliff, it seems like they just don't care about this kind of stuff. They're not aware of the debates. They just dismiss any kind of academic and scholarly discussions. Who cares? And they just assume their position. That's not going to work when you're in a discussion with an atheist, you know, a Mormon, or a Muslim or someone else. You're going to have to kind of be aware of some of these things. So even if you reject the conclusions, general conclusions of scholars in the area, you at least need to be aware of the discussions and have a strong reason for why you take a minority position. And I didn't see that from Cliff. It was incredibly embarrassing. Or from Stewart. It was also very obvious they had a lack of awareness when it comes to the development of the Trinity, the question of the Trinity and the patristic literature. In the New Testament text, right, there was a great deal of ignorance on that particular question. And, you know, I think at one point he was asked who was a Trinitarian in the first 3 centuries. Who cares? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were Trinitarians. Begging the question, because the question is that the proper interpretation of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? the way to know it's a proper interpretation is to look to tradition, to look to the witnesses of tradition, which would be the patristic literature. If you don't find it there, then there's a difficulty in substantiating the claim that this is the proper interpretation of the text. You're going to have to appeal to some witnesses to this tradition, and appealing to Nicaea is going to be late for a lot of people, and so that's why it was asked in the first 300 years. And so he just had no response there. It was clear he doesn't know anything about the patristic tradition, doesn't even care, likely because he takes this very extreme evangelical perspective, which he was very offended, by the way, when an Orthodox Muslim called him an evangelical. I don't know why he was offended by that. So Cliff, you're not an evangelical? I mean, and since when is evangelical a bad thing? Well, I know in Orthodox and Catholic circles it kind of is a derogatory term. But for evangelicals it isn't. So you as an evangelical, you shouldn't be offended by that term. What's up with that? Maybe he's not an evangelical. I don't know. So that was a little weird to me. And then ultimately you have to say their conduct was incredibly off-putting. It was clear they were rattled. It was clear they didn't know what they were getting into. It was clear that they were just coming with basic standard talking points that you constantly hear from every TikToker online. They were coming with that thinking that they had fire, and then they got shut down really quickly. You know, Orthodox Muslim Korra, they've heard these arguments a million times. They have their prepared responses. They're not even aware of the prepared responses. Like Cliff and Stewart, they're not even past that first level of conversation, let alone the second level, third level of the back and forth and exchange. So they went into this completely unaware, thinking that they had a slam dunk, and they just got dunked on. And it was, okay, well, hey, look, you're doing poorly. That's one thing. But when your conduct is bad, that's another. If somebody just doesn't know, they don't know what they got into, they don't know what they don't know, I can kind of give them a pass if they are respectful, if they're humble, if they're not prideful. But the Knechtles were anything but humble. They were aggressive, they were angry, they were, it was very clear that they were hostile. And I think what it was is they were seeing their arguments were trash. They were getting massacred. And they didn't know what to do, so they had to put on this front and fake the fact that, or pretend that they're not doing so poorly, and fake that they're actually doing well, when in reality they knew they were getting creamed. I think that's where that was coming from, but either way it was disgusting, it was off-putting. It's not good etiquette. That's not good behavior. And I think more should be expected of apologists in these conversations when it comes to etiquette. At the very least, if your arguments are trash, at least be good in character. But don't have both. Don't have trash arguments and trash character. I mean, what are you doing at this point? You're just making it look bad, right? You're making the Christian position look really, really bad. And it was especially Cliff, I have to say. A little less Stewart. There were some moments with Stewart, but it was more Cliff, really aggressive, ridiculous posturing, pretending like he's making a good point when he's not, and then pretending like he's responding to the responses to his points when he's not, and just outright dismissing the responses. An unbiased, objective observer will quickly see those things and will be turned off by it. So I think that they did horrible, and they were an incredibly bad witness for the Christian position. And my suggestion and advice for the Knechtles is to get out of apologetics, retire, just stop doing what you're doing 100%, or at the very least in these conversations where you don't know what you're talking about, get out of them. And you might want to work on that character issue, because this was really, really bad and everybody could see it. Anyways, those are my thoughts on it. Not to be too harsh on them, but I was incredibly shocked and I guess even offended by some of their conduct there. And so I felt I should say something here. Anyways, hey, make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Plenty more content coming your way. We'll see you later. Take care.
Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/reason and theology.